I'm honored to welcome you all here, as well as our speaker today, Justin Hampton. Justin, welcome.
Hey. Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for standing, sitting, crowding. Let's see, let's pull this thing up. That is creeping me out that I can hear myself behind me. All right. So today what I want to talk about was how to stay competitive even when the data doesn't support it. And a lot of what we'll talk about is we'll talk about some of the things that I've just done in my past as a comp practitioner for about 15 years. So I don't have any silver bullets or magic tricks or anything like that. But what I do offer, and I hope that everyone can take away from the session, is just some really pragmatic approaches to what do we do today as comp practitioners, when we've got all this data, but maybe the data is not telling us what we're hearing or what we're seeing in the market. So for those of you who don't know, Justin Hampton, I'm the founder of the compensation tool. We've kind of got this market pricing, benchmarking solution, and the real-time data solution as well. So as you can expect, I'm kind of a data nerd and really like getting through this. So I've got a timer right here. So the best I've done in this presentation is about 45 minutes. So we'll have some time for Q&A, but I'd also say, go ahead and ask me some easy questions as we're going through it. Or hard questions are okay too, because someone will know it. So the thing I want to kind of start talking about first is what happened. I think that's one of the reasons we're all here today is in the last 18, 24 months, things have gotten really weird. Probably more strange than what most of us have seen. I mean, certainly the most strange I've seen in the 15 years I've been practicing comp. And probably as strange as it's been for a lot of folks. You've got everyone leaving. Everyone's going to live somewhere else with the remote work. When everybody all of a sudden, when I started my company, which was March of 2020, like everybody else was suddenly remote, which I was like, I was a little bit jealous, but I was like, that's okay. We still do this. We're still remote. But I think we saw like 70% of workers became remote workers. In some fields, 100% were remote workers. And so after we kind of realized that wasn't going to be a thing for 2 weeks or 2 months, and we're like still kind of working through it. People said, well, I don't really need to stay here. I can go there. I can go to the mountains. I can go where my family is. I moved to Mexico. like I went on vacation and realized I don't have to go back. So Seattle was great, the 2 weeks of the year that you get the sun, but I live 2 blocks from the beach now, and we've doubled, tripled, quadrupled our business since then. So I think we've seen a lot of folks having great success doing that. Everyone quit their job. I don't know if you guys knew this, but March, more people quit their jobs voluntarily than ever before in the US. We'll go through some more of this stuff in detail as well. But we got everyone leaving, we got everyone quitting. We've also got everyone earning a little bit less, not because they're making less. Most people aren't making less, but everyone's dollar is worth not a little bit less, but a lot less than it was 2 or 3 months ago. 8.5% inflation rates right now. And that is if we didn't need to make that more complicated. The states, government's helped us a lot. With New York, Washington State, now if you didn't know Washington State, that's effective January 1st of 2023. California is going to be doing it next. I think it's 2025 when their big changes happen. Jersey City, New Jersey, Toledo, you're really starting to see this pay transparency thing become, Pandora's box is open. It's not going away. And I think it's really interesting with what it's doing to comp and HR and recruiting and other applications of what we do. So I'm going to hop into this next one. I think is a really interesting slide. So what this talks about is, we hear, okay, everyone's quitting. March 2022, more people quit their jobs than ever before. 4.5 million people in the United States quit their jobs in March alone. That record stood for 1 month. The month before that was also a record. But that record stood for 2 months because prior to that, November was the month that everyone quit their job in. And what's really interesting to me is there's a lot of discussion, everyone's like, oh, it's crazy. Everyone's leaving. COVID, no, we were already doing this. This was already going to happen. So if you look at that trend, it goes back to 2012. We're only slightly above where my line of best fit that I drew on there with Microsoft Paint would have put us. But I think the real point for this I want to drive home is it's not going to get easier to hire people. It's not going to get easier to keep people. This was already starting to happen. COVID just kind of brought it to everybody's attention. And it's closing time. So this actually, I think, is probably one of the more interesting things that really kind of starts to tell the story about what's going on for us, for our recruiting teams especially. I think the other slide, which was talking about how people are quitting, retention rates being so difficult. This one is now talking about where are the employees. This number has never been as low as it is today. And this number is from the Department of Labor Statistics, the JOLTS survey. I think I pulled this one specifically from the EPI, which is the Economic Policy Institute. Now, what this one tracks is qualified job seekers to jobs. And we're at a rate of 0.56 jobs to job seekers to jobs. We have twice as many jobs as we have job seekers. Now, prior to COVID, before that big uptick is, you actually see that number was a little bit higher. It was about 0.8. So you had 0.8 jobs seekers per job. That number is 30% less than it was 2 years ago. And you can see it was kind of moving down and moving down. If you stretch this out to 2000, prior to that, the lowest that number had ever been was 1.1. And so if you think about where we're at now versus where we were at 20 years ago, there are half job seekers there are today as there were 20 years ago. 30% fewer job seekers today as there were 2 years ago. And this, just for clarification, this is job seekers. This isn't unemployed, it is job seekers. So there's a differentiation there that's really important. And like I was saying, inflation became a thing. So we're now at 8.5% inflation, which is, what that's doing is that's really kind of changing expectations of employees, especially the ones that mess around with Bitcoin, about how much money they should be taking home, because everyone's dollar is a little bit weaker. And so with all those things, as I mentioned, now we've got the government helping with creating these, the prevalence of pay transparency is becoming very, very common. We've got Washington, Maryland, Toledo, California, Colorado, Nevada. I don't need to read those. But I think one of the really interesting things that I have seen is you've now got this prevalence of companies that are states and cities. You have to post the ranges in the descriptions. And the driver behind this is for pay equity. And one of the things I find really, and I don't have any, this is me like pontificating and thinking out loud, maybe not a good idea, but California has this law where many states have the laws where employees have to ask. Now, I think this actually is probably driving pay equity further apart. And the reason I actually think that is because there are many studies that have been done that suggest that women are less likely to ask questions in professional scenarios. In seminars, there's lots of studies where there are seminars where men are more likely to ask questions, women are not. So think about that. You are now telling everyone, sure, you have to ask for the rate of pay. You're not giving it to them, you have to ask for it. So if you take that same idea and apply that to people asking for wages in kind of these professional settings, you're creating this asymmetry of information with men. So now men have more information, possibly more information than women when they go to negotiate, which I think could actually be driving these wages further apart. So when we see what's happening in Toledo and Washington State and New York City in November 1st, and then Colorado, in my opinion, if you want to really influence and change that wage gap, this is going to be the direction that people start going. And we're already kind of seeing that become more and more prevalent. So these are some of the things that have happened. But how have we responded? So there's been an impact and a response. It's gotten hard to keep talent, so we have bigger merit budgets. And I had some numbers on my phone, but I can't use my phone right now because we're actually live streaming this on LinkedIn for the people that couldn't see it. But there were some numbers around that. I think 45% of companies have slightly larger merit budgets this year. That kind of weird. Market adjustments, we're seeing big wage growth. It's hard to pay talent, so people have gotten more aggressive. Nobody's wearing pants, so those have become optional in a lot of companies. It's gotten harder to hire talent. So, I mean, for a lot of companies, especially in the healthcare industry, sign-on bonuses have become the ticket to the dance. I mean, we've seen that grow and grow and grow. Budgets got slashed. So a lot of you guys skip salary surveys or participating. I got a slide that's going to show you kind of why you should have participated this year. It's actually really interesting what that volatility does year over year and why it's so important that your salary surveys, which are really kind of the gold standard for understanding what the market is, really we want to make sure we are encouraging our peers and everybody to participate in those. Because they're the best source of data that we've got. They've got some limitations that we'll go through, but they are absolutely critical. So now we're going to start talking about, and feel free to throw questions too. I mean, I think I'm not too far behind, but we're too far ahead. So, I think one of the questions is, competitive, right? How do we be competitive? How do we pay people what we pay? Well, when we're deciding how to pay people, well, what do we look at? We look at, someone tell me what we look at. I'll give them a shirt.
Experience.
Oh, that's too many people now. I can't do this so fast. I'm going to put these here. You can come in on the honor system and grab one later. So geographic locations, experience, tenure, put salary survey. What's that data say? We're also looking at KSAs. What are these people? But it goes beyond that. I think it's not really a straight line from here's the camp to the offer. Everybody has a story about why they're being paid, what they're being paid. You look at your pay range. You look at internal equity. Where is that job being put? And that could be all over the place now. If it's a current employee? I mean, because everyone has that story. It's not just candidates, it's current employees as well. What's their performance? Do we have budget to give them more money? I mean, think about that. That's a huge driver of what people are earning. If there's budget, we're much more likely to make more generous adjustments that are lifelong impacting on that person's total earned income. We're looking at pay ranges, budgets. Where are we? Is the employee a flight risk? That is certainly going to drive up pay for a lot of folks, and it's something we don't really consider all the time. Other pieces are, where are we? Competitors and seasonal pressure. What are our competitors paying? I mean, right now, if you've got this growth, this influx of people coming into the market with, unfortunately, some of the layoffs, that could potentially make it easier to hire folks that if you're looking for potential areas. Seasonal pressures. This is a really fascinating one, and one that we all kind of know, but one that we may not recognize. It's a lot easier to hire a lifeguard in December than it is in July. But one of the things that we do with our squirrel tool, we track these live wages, is we first got started, we were looking at the data, and we looked at housekeepers, and we can track it month over month. And there was this big spike in May, and I was talking to someone at the hotel company, and I don't know, I'm sorry, sometimes there's just weirdness in the data. And she said, no, that's high season. We start hiring in June, so wages get much more competitive in May, and then it comes back down. It's fascinating. So you can actually track some of these things, and you can see these things as you're going to hire folks. And we probably all realize it, and it's probably some of the stuff you hear from your recruiting team, your HR managers. They're like, oh, no, everything's super high. And maybe it is that month, but maybe a month or 2 months later, it's going to come back down because of whatever seasonal pressures you may be seeing. And so I think that's one of the really, really fascinating things that we have uncovered with some of the data that we've got, and probably something that everyone knows but has a hard time explaining. So the thesis for this presentation is, how do we stay competitive when the data doesn't support it? And it's a multi-tiered approach. There's not one thing that you can do. You have to do multiple things. But really, the first thing starts with having accurate market data. And so we'll kind of go into that market data. And one of the things we like to talk about is, what is it that salary surveys do exceedingly well? They're the most comprehensive sources of wage data. They're definitely the most validated sources of wage data. As a comp practitioner, especially when I was getting started, I had so many calls from Mercer and Aon and Culpeper that were like, dude, did you spend any time filling this out at all? So I know they validate it. Sorry, Lee. But it's truly good because that's what we want. I mean, we want to have valid data. We want to have them come back, review the data we've submitted, But one of the interesting things is, what head of comp in here completes the salary surveys? I don't think so. It's typically going to be, this is how we're going to introduce the new person to compensation.
Oh, you're gonna love it.
Well, today they said not to give it to that person.
They can help.
They said that person knows nothing and will have too many.
It's really challenging. And what's funny is if we think about this as being such a foundational part of compensation, it's not bad advice to have someone that really understands what the jobs are, what the nuances are, the leveling guidelines. I've seen it myself where lots of folks will work with different parts of the business to collect the data and then submit it and then have it reviewed. I've had several folks review my data and tell me to do it again. But they're also fantastic sources for pay practices and policies. So this to me is one of the most overlooked parts of the salary surveys is go past that spreadsheet, get into the survey data that you're sending you, because you're going to find information about the compensation philosophies. You'll find information about shift differentials, geographic differentials. World at Work has so many great reasons. It's a little bit different than the salary surveys per se. But go to Google, type in World at Work pay practices PDF. It's going to be the first thing you find. And I'm sure it's on the site somewhere too, but I know how to find it through Google. But honestly, it has some of the best information out there in terms of your pay practices and pay policies. And a lot of the survey companies really give you that ability to drill into that data at a very, very high level of granularity and high level of detail. You can create peer groups. You can look at revenues, cuts, head counts, industry, locations. And we'll talk about why that's a good or a bad idea too. And just shout out to some of these great surveys. These are really kind of some of the surveys I would really strongly recommend taking a look at. Surveys are oftentimes going to get pretty expensive, but if you think about what the cost, we all have this. The people that we support, our human capital is the most expensive part of the business that we've got. So, $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, it's really a drop in the bucket when you consider all of the information you're getting and what that is doing and how you're applying that to the biggest cost you have as a business. And many of these tools too, many of the surveys actually have kind of subsets of the data that you can get for $2,000 or $3,000. Really. So while we have talked about hopefully I'm getting Papa's and my girl that are coming up here. While we're talking about surveys though, one of the things I've found and really believe is you have to understand the limitations of the surveys because they're not perfect. There's no single set of data source out there that is perfect. So understanding the limitations is really going to help you make better decisions around the data. And one of the biggest limitations I think about salary surveys is they look into the past. By law. I don't know if it's a law or a guideline, but you don't want to look at data that you called your friends over at another company and get that data. You don't want to look at data that's violating safe harbor guidelines. So safe harbor guidelines, anyone can come get a shirt, they know these things. Who knows the safe harbor guideline thing? Yeah.
The 90 days.
I was on there, that's cheap.
We went over it in an earlier session.
So that's a big challenge. Anyone else? What's another one?
At least 4 or 5 days.
Yeah, 5 data sources. No data source can comprise more than 25% of the surveys as well. Yeah.
Administered by
Third party, yep. So that's why they get a little more expensive. But also why they get to be validated and trusted. And then let's see, there was another one, 90 days, anonymized, of course. So they've got to be anonymous. And this is kind of where I see one of the challenges. If you think about what salary surveys are, they're looking into the past. And it doesn't really, no one knows what the age data at this point right now. No one has any idea. 3%, 5%, who knows? But if you think about that 3%, this is one of how we can kind of track job postings. And so what we found was that 3 months ago, or 12 months ago, I think that one is like a 15% jump in the hiring rates for baristas that we tracked with 7,000 data points roughly. And if you're looking at data that's 3 months old, that's not necessarily going to give you the most up-to-date data, even if you age it, especially because the aging changes depending on the type of roles. hourly non-professional roles are accelerating at a rate much greater than your senior level roles. So kind of being able to look into the future, and this is stuff that everyone can do. This is a tool that we use to put everything together, but there's nothing stopping everybody from using that job posting data that's out there. Go to Indeed, go to Glassdoor. Don't look at what they estimate. Look at the actual rates of pay that are posted by companies. That's actually what companies are paying, which is really interesting because it also goes to, I think, a really critical part about the market data and how to interpret it. So one of the really great things about the salary surveys is they've got so much data. They're looking at everything. They're looking at the entire market. And that's really what you want to benchmark your compensation philosophy against. But that's not what you're competing with. You're only competing with that top piece of the iceberg. You may have employees that are happily engaged, that are happily employed, that are highly employable, and they're flight risks. But if they're not looking for a job, they're not a job seeker, they may not have that same premium. So this is oftentimes one of the reasons why we're seeing, or why your recruiters are seeing, why your employees are bringing these things printed up on a piece of paper and say, well, I can go make this much more at this company, this much more at this company. And you're looking at your market data and you're like, this is the same job, but and we're spot on what's going on. This to me is one of the more compelling reasons why, looking at salary surveys, they look at so much data, but it's not the most relevant data for what you're competing with today. And this is totally made up numbers, but this is just kind of that visualization of, salary survey maybe at 75 to 8. You may see your people that you have a little bit right around there, but then you go to the market to see what companies are paying. Job seekers are almost always going to carry a premium, especially in different parts of organizations, different industries. And that's why you're going to see, especially today with 8.5% inflation, that job seekers are carrying a premium for the roles. And this is why you sometimes are going to see that misalignment to what your survey is telling you. And this to me is the most important slide in the whole deck, because this is where, I as a comp person was always a big data snob, and we want to use this kind of data and these kind of surveys and only these, and we'll never look at anything else. We're going to do exactly what this data point says. But I was at a company and they were like, we're going to move to a pure market-based structure. And I know there are people here that disagree with me, but I think these are the worst structures you can possibly make as a competition. I think they are more difficult to administer. I think they are less accurate. And I think they ignore the year-over-year volatility that a lot of folks have. And I shouldn't say they're the worst, because I know every organization has different needs, but I think that these have some very significant flaws. And this chart here is one of those. So what I did with this is to kind of get away from I don't want to do a pure market-based structure, which is what the company that acquired us wanted us to do. I was challenging to work with. So I took all of the survey data from one year to the next, and I said, if that job exists this year at the national sample and it exists the previous year, what's the delta between the two? And then, so that's what that x-axis is. We see negative 25% to positive 25% change. And what we actually found, this is 2017 to 2018, and this is a survey that probably most of us have. I won't say which one, but we actually found that 19% of jobs decreased in market value from one year to the next. And I think it's about 7% of jobs, 5 to 7% of jobs, increased more than 10% in 1 year. And that's not to say that there aren't going to be hot jobs that are truly increasing that much every year. But 20% of the jobs decreasing from 1 year to the next, I have a hard time buying that. I mean, really what I think is what's happening is the cohorts are changing in the survey data. And, I don't know if you guys follow me on LinkedIn. If you do, awesome. But I run a lot of polls, and we've got a pretty good network. So typically our polls will get 300 to 400 answers from mostly folks like you guys. I'm almost exclusively connected with compensation professionals. So we ran a poll that I think had 400 or so participants, and 95% of those that have a pure market-based structure do not bring the data down. The data suggests it comes down. So when I look at that, 95% of companies are just kind of ignoring what that market is. So how do you know that year that you picked that that's the right data point and the next year's not the right data point? To me, that's kind of one of the biggest challenges I've seen with using a single data point and putting too much faith in the salary survey data. And so this is for base. You see, it's pretty closely matched. That's total target comp. And for total target direct, you see it's much more volatile. So this is 2017 to 2018. Mariah said that I was going to show you guys empirically why it was important to participate in surveys every year. What do you think it did from 2019 or 2020 to 2021? It went up or went down? You would think. That's what I thought. We took the same survey, and this is a major survey. 40% of jobs moved down that year from 2020 to 2021.
Lack of participation.
Lack of participation, yeah. So when that cohort changes that much, you really see a lot of volatility in the survey. In fact, 3% is like right here, 75th percentile. 75% of jobs from 2020 to 21 moved less than 3% that year. And so I think that understanding that volatility, and this really goes to the point why it is so important for us to really continually participate in our salary surveys and use multiple salary survey sources, because you control that volatility with multiple sources, but also why it's maybe not the wisest idea to place so much faith in that data. We have to use our discretion. And let's see. Oh, there we go. That's negative. Oh, there we go. I don't know why I put animations in there. It always does that. All right. So, in the wrong hands, surveys also enable bad decisions. So, who shares their surveys with their line managers? Show of hands. Okay. Okay. And I think in some cases it can be the right thing to do when you're wanting to kind of help them explain and kind of pull back the curtain. It can help. What about HR business partners? Okay, a lot more. And this is, you're sharing the market data with them as well to kind of run through it. Okay. And then, well, there was one other, but probably no one shares with employees, I would hope. I mean, if you do, you should be up here. That would be amazing. So one of the bad decisions I think that people make is how they use that data. So I was working for a company, and we were doing a market review, and we were looking at all these different jobs, and they were like, okay, well, we want to look at, this is from the executive level, they said, we want to look at other companies that are in our same industry or our same headcount. Like, guys, there's like 7 of those. I was like, we're in Seattle, we have an office in the Bay, and I was like, well, we should probably look at a lot of, everything out there, because we're competing with Facebook and Amazon. They're all there. They said, yeah, we're not a huge company like that. We don't compete with Facebook and Amazon. They compete with us. So, we did this evaluation. We looked at this was our recruiting. We looked at the recruiting team. Our data was a little bit low when we looked at kind of the total sample, because you have these just tech behemoths in the area that just kind of push total comps up. They said, well, let's actually dial that back and let's look at companies that are our same revenue, headcount size. Okay, so we did that. We brought that data down a little bit. Okay, so it's more reasonable. Everyone was happy with it for a minute. So let's see, what's my next slide? So one of the things we did was we started looking at that data. I'm trying to think which one I want to talk about next. I'll keep going on this path. So what we wanted to actually do is we started looking at the data, and I said, guys, I think we're paying a little bit low. I said, well, we can't compete with those guys. So one of our employees, one of the recruiters, he decided to go see what was out there. And he got an offer from Facebook. And no joke, Facebook paid him twice as much to go work there. I mean, not even an exaggeration. And it's not, I was the account manager. He wasn't underpaid. He was paid competitively. But the thing is that Facebook paid a lot more. And unbeknownst to him, and we'll kind of talk about this a little later, is unbeknownst to our head of HR, that recruiter was kind of the glue that held the recruiting team together. So when he leaves, and everyone's still going out to like happy hour with him, and he's like, they pay me twice as much. We got better parental leave. Like, we're not doing happy hour anymore with you. But what happened was, guess where the recruiting team started looking? We lost our entire recruiting team to Facebook within 6 months. Because we don't compete with them. But for me, that was a tough one. Like, how do you actually argue that? How do you actually say, well, we need to look at these companies? So one of the bad types of decisions is limiting the data that you look at. And I think that there's, a lot of us want to look at industry and headcount or revenue to kind of look at apples to apples. And in some situations, that's perfectly acceptable to do. But you can't do that at the expense of looking at the companies you're competing with. So how do you talk to leadership to say, well, we want to actually make sure we're competing with the right people? So this is what I call Project Waldo. I've written some blogs about this, and Project Waldo stands for Where Are Leaders Departing and Originating? We could probably call it something else better, but I like that. And then basically the idea is figure out who you're really competing with. And how do you do that? Well, it's kind of like stalkery. So what we did, the company I worked for, we had fewer than 1,000 employees. Our attrition rate was around 22% or so. So that means we lost about 200 employees per year. We hired about 150 to 200 per year as well. So what we did is 350, 400 employees. It's a lot, but it's not too terribly many. To go onto LinkedIn, stalk them, find out where they went. If you don't have the interviews, find out where they went, where they left to, or go look at the exit interviews or also look for your new employees. Where did they come from? That's your talent pool. That is your actual talent pool. We did this for the company I was at. Do you know how many people came from our same industry that we compared ourselves to? 5. like 400. 5 people came from that peer cut that we looked at. It's just such a misalignment of the expectation and the reality of what the executive leadership said we should look at versus what the reality of who you're competing with was. And so I think this is one of the most fascinating approaches that I've ever taken to really kind of drive home to leadership. Like, no, this is actually, you don't say we compete with Facebook. Here's 20 employees we lost to Facebook. They're all making more. But we'll kind of talk a little more about that as well. But the second piece is, that's the first foundation, is understanding the data that you've got. The second foundation, and again, I really hope through this, you've got kind of getting some ideas that you can actually take back with you, because none of this stuff requires any tools or software. It just requires kind of like an intern. But employee opportunities, that is, I think, kind of one of the things that people really kind of take for granted sometimes, is how important that is. And so, I think we say this many, many times. We know this, and for us, it's great to say because we're comp. People don't leave for money. They leave because of managers or opportunities. So that employee that I was talking about that left, well, there's more to that story. He actually left because when we lost our head of recruiting, he'd never been a manager, but he would have been a great manager. He kind of carried the whole team, as evidenced by when they all left. So what happened was we talked to him and we didn't give him an opportunity to take that next level job. We didn't invest in him the way we should have to kind of give him that opportunity to grow. And what we actually found is that impacted our business across multiple parts of the business. So we actually had another office. Our attrition rate was like 50% that year. Managers were like, oh, we don't pay enough. Executive leadership was saying we don't pay enough. None of the employees were saying that. They were saying, we don't know what our job is. We don't know what we're supposed to do. We have no job descriptions. Our managers are not good. And this is really the things that we're talking about. So what we did was we actually sat down with all the managers in that office and said, we're going to develop job descriptions for every single one of your employees. We're going to make sure that every job in this part of the company has a career path. So we actually built that, but it took several months. It wasn't an easy task. But when we did that, we dropped that attrition rate from 50% to 23% the next year. And we joked that like everyone's already gone, so it was easy to do. But we actually kept it at about industry standard for about 2 or 3 years after that. So it was such a big part of the reason for leaving was because they didn't know what was expected of them or what they needed to do to get to that next level within the organization. And I think that one of the things we did as part of this was we actually created very well-defined job levels. That's so critical. We found much manager misalignment within some of the jobs. And in fact, we one part of the business that was paying all their software engineer 3s more than they were paying, everyone else was paying their software engineer 4s because they didn't understand levels. They were still promoting and giving kind of, I don't know if that looks good of me or not, but that's what was happening. We were finding out that they didn't understand a level 3 versus level 4. So they weren't promoting, but they were still providing a much larger amount of merit adjustments, market adjustments to kind of make sure people were competitive. One of the best things I did was I said, cool, you wrote a job description, go write 4 more. And I got a lot of pushback on this, but it was the best thing I, as a comp manager, ever did. And what it did was we got rid of things like a principal marketing manager with 2 years of experience that supports the business. How many of you guys have seen this? Like the managers will come out and they'll write a description and they'll be like, here you go. And you're like, what is this? Like that's craziness. So we created these job matrices, and it was basically like, here's the skills, here's levels 1, 2, 3, 4. We had 5 levels at the organization. I thought we didn't share there was a 5th level. We used that for kind of more ad hoc, as the company needed, because obviously there's that proliferation of folks into more highly paid roles that we all see. So we just kind of had that in back pocket. Our senior leadership knew that we had that if we needed to, we could promote into it. We just didn't make that immediately out there for everybody. But it was available. People knew people that were in the level 5 role. It wasn't a secret. We just didn't want to kind of say, sure, here you go. But what we did was we created this matrix where basically any manager that created a job description, they needed to create 4 of them. And it probably took about 20% more effort because you're adding a couple of bullets, you're changing some adjectives. I mean, you're truly not making dramatic changes. But ultimately what it did was when we went to go hire folks, is it made the manager much more intentional with what they needed for their business. It made them really kind of actually take a look at their team and say, Susie's level 3, but we're trying to hire a level 4, but she could probably do this. So it helped people to right size the kind of roles they wanted to put in there. And someone told me that these one-off jobs, they call them Frankenstein jobs because they were just kind of like parts of other things and ran around in constant terror, which that was kind of funny. But that, honestly, that is one of the best things I ever did. But also, one of the things, you're asking managers to write 5 job descriptions and kind of go through that. And that's not fun. Like, no one likes writing job descriptions. What we actually found was a really effective way to do that was to build books that the managers could have. So what we would actually do is and this is a great opportunity to really kind of reinforce kind of the pay philosophy. So we'd work with our project teams. They would have, like, marketing is a great example. They would have 5 or 6 different jobs that they would build out, and then maybe 3 or 4 families, product marketing, channel marketing, what have you. We'd put everything together, make them internally level those out. But they would all get a book with the career levels, the pay philosophy on the first page, kind of how our approach to comping jobs out was. So, and that was something they could share with employees. So employees could actually see, like, oh, that's the pay philosophy. What that means, they need to come to one of our sessions, but also kind of what does it take to get from one level to the next. Let's see. All right. No, I don't know why that's there again. Yep. So again, it requires a multi-tiered approach. And one of the things that I always kind of like to reiterate is it requires flexibility. So I'm a big fan of traditional pay structures. I just am. I think they provide you a lot more flexibility when those seasonal changes happen, when those market pressures are happening, when you're seeing the markets move at a rate, that we haven't seen in years and years. With these traditional ranges, they can still give you that flexibility to actually push up and higher within the range that may be outside of the 75th percentile of the market from that data point that you collected 8 months, 9 months, 10, 12 months ago. Because what we're seeing with baristas, for example, it's 15% more expensive to hire them now than it was a year ago. And so by having these flexible ranges, it gives you a lot of discretion, and it really helps to kind of make sure that you are valuing that internal equity piece. It's really so important. Just curious, is there who in here has traditional pay ranges where, grade 5 through 10, like traditional, okay, so it's about 50%. Who has the pure market-based pay structures? I won't look. It's smaller. What are the challenges with that, with the pure market structures? I mean, have you found them to be more difficult to manage this year?
We have a combination, so we do some structure, some straight market, but it's that year over year that suddenly someone goes to 400,000 more in total comp. And how do you handle that?
Yeah, but how do you handle that? It's tough. I mean, you're always working with that imperfect data. So if we kind of move to the next one, again, we need to use that our discretion. And I think one of the things I always encourage folks to do is kind of push back on the data. If it doesn't make sense, figure out why it doesn't make sense. One of the things I would do with a lot of managers, especially recruiting managers and line managers, when they come in and they would say, oh, I can't hire these guys. We've got 10 candidates, none of them, we can't hire any of them. What I would do is I would say, well, bring me the resumes, tell me how much they're asking for. Why can't we hire those folks? I bet you 4 out of 5 times, there's 2 things that are happening. One of those things is we've got a job posted that has 3 to 5 years experience, and their ideal candidate is perfectly qualified, has 10 years of experience. And again, it goes back to that misleveling of the jobs. But actually looking at those jobs, the resumes and understanding is that can also help you re-level the job because there may be a misalignment with what the employee or the manager expects and what the actual role they need for their business is. So those can be some really great ways to find out and make sure you've got the job level. And if it's totally off, you can re-level the job, repost it. And sometimes that actually happens. Another thing too is that we found is that you can hire the person, they're just gonna be high in the range. There's oftentimes with a lot of companies I've worked with, the misconception that we need to stay at a under midpoint or right at midpoint. And from an internal equity perspective, that is something you have to consider. But at the same time, you can't stop hiring people because you haven't made those adjustments yet. It's very difficult, but if you can plan how you're going to adjust those employees' rates of pay in a near term, because they're going to talk. I mean, the employees talk. I've heard them on the bus. I've heard them everywhere at all levels of how much they're getting paid. Last thing you want to happen is you bring someone on and you're like, oh yeah, this is great. I'm so glad we all make $200,000, and they're like, what? And so, if nothing else, if you have to make those hires, make sure you also have a plan and can work with the finance team to get budget and approvals to adjust the folks that are now kind of internally misaligned. Compression is becoming a really significant thing this year. Question the stakeholders, and then this actually I think was one of the things that made me a pretty good comp person was making business decisions. It took me longer in my career to get there, but eventually I became to think of myself as as I got kind of more senior in the company, I was working with more executive leadership teams. My thought process changed. I was like, well, I'm not actually a comp person anymore. I'm a business person, but I know comp. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to support the business through that lens of compensation that I know. And I'm going to let them push back. I'm going to hear their perspectives. I'm going to hear kind of the challenges they're having. We're going to figure out how to solve that problem. And I'm going to solve that problem-solving piece with my compensation knowledge, knowing that I'm going to have probably more knowledge than some of the other folks that are on the finance team or the operations side. And if you can do that in a very constructive way and really understand and empathize with the pain parts of the business you're having, I think that's where you get a lot of great, the ability to really kind of start solving those problems and become an advocate and a partner for your businesses versus kind of HR gets a bad rap sometimes. We're known as roadblocks. But I think if anything else, this is everyone should say this when you go into like a new job team review meeting. I'm not here to make our data line up to a spreadsheet. I'm here to make us competitive. That would, no kidding, I could see people go, oh, thank God, like you get it. And you do eventually. And I think this is probably the most important thing. Don't make compensation possible to figure out. I've worked with countless folks on incredibly complex sales plans, incredibly complex, and they've kind of narrowed down every single part of this business plan with the bonuses. They've got 14 metrics, and they've waited till you've drew them out, and you're just like, what are you doing? I mean, we've literally taken 10 different models from 10 different metrics and 10 different weightings. Worst case to best case, the biggest variance between those 10 was like 17%, which you look at someone's total overall comp, it's like 1.7% of what they're taking home. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. It's not going to change the drivers. What you really want to focus on is making sure that you can re-emphasize what you're trying to drive to compensation programs. Is it revenue? Is it EBITDA? Is it making sure that you're hitting OKRs and things of that nature? Those are the things that you really want to emphasize and make sure people understand. So you can have the best comp program out there. No one understands it and no one buys into it. You're not going to get very far with it. And so with that one, 45 minutes. So that's me. If we've got some time, I'd love to talk shop and yeah.
So, what do you think is going to happen in the next 6 months? Like, there's talk of recession, so I feel like we're looking at like rates of rate, right? And then layoffs.
Yeah. So the question is, what do I see happening in the next 6 months? It's tough to say, but I think there are lots of signs that the market is cooling off. I know, especially from the position that I sit in, kind of the folks that I talk to, we are certainly starting to see that. I mean, I think we've seen the market change significantly. I think all the FANG companies are down, 30%. Bitcoin's down like whatever it is to 30 or 40%. So I think that what we're going to see is some of those numbers where we saw the worker scarcity and the number of people quitting. There's another slide that I didn't include on here, but it actually looks back at the recession of 2008 and basically how many people quit their jobs. it was 4 years before we kind of got back to that more positive, increase of people quitting their jobs. It outlasted the recession before the numbers started to come up again by, a year or two. So once you start seeing that where employees, workers, I think right now employees hold all the cards. When they can go out and say, oh, I'll just go work from Mexico or wherever, I'm going to make, Bay Area money. Thanks, Spotify. Where you kind of start, that's going to start to change, I think, because I think when, as we're starting to see these layoffs starting to happen with some of the big tech companies, you're going to start to see that worker scarcity number increase, where not all of a sudden now instead of 0.56 workers per job, you've got 0.6, 0.65, 0.7, and you're going to start, that perception is going to start changing the way people think and their likelihood to leave their jobs. So you're going to see that start to change, and you're going to see those job quit rates start to decrease over time. I think we're probably pretty close to the peak. If I looked at my crystal ball, I'm not an economist by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think kind of historically this is kind of the stuff that we have seen starting to happen. I think if we're going to have a little bit easier time as comp recruiting HR folks, but we're still going to be at some pretty strong highs in terms of worker scarcity, people wanting to work remotely, and then people quitting their jobs. I think we're going to see that pull back, but it's not going to be anything like, we're not going to have an easy time ahead of us, certainly.
How do you work on breaking the mindset of people who are not open to like remote work?
How do I break the mindset of people not open to remote work? It's tough. I think I'm a numbers guy, and so I think if you can kind of come back to companies and say, it's we get 3 times the number of applicants from remote work jobs. First, we couldn't survive as a company if we didn't support remote work. We could not hire folks in Seattle or the Bay. So what's allowed us to do is actually open up our talent pool to look at different markets where they don't need to make $100,000 to be above the poverty line. It's one of the things that I have seen is you start to look at what does the business need, and do we need more workers? Are we okay with workers? Do we need to cut back on some of our employee spend, or are we having a hard time finding folks? And I think that's where you can start to really kind of push and say it does make sense for us to start looking remotely. Some of our tools let us, you can look geographically to see where those labor hotspots are. And I mean, no surprise to anybody, like the Bay, New York, all these locations are very expensive. And you see fewer and fewer folks that are willing to come to the office. And I think that's going to change a little bit as some of the cards go back to the employer. But I think for now, it's that's probably the best way you can go about it, is pushing back some of the numbers.
And then not saying that it's a bad idea to want to do it. I don't really want to do it. But then how do you handle workers' comp?
Workers' comp?
Yeah.
I could not tell you that one. Let's just hope I don't have to. Yeah, you had a question.
Yeah, so I guess one question, obviously, foundation, third-party consulting, surveys, validated. One struggle that we experience, and I think a lot of companies experience from a global perspective, is having data that is not public.
Yeah.
For countries,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, you go out to the survey vendors, we don't have data for that country for this year. How do you think we as rewards professionals and companies can get better at that?
Sure.
Trying to deliver that data and also, see some stability.
Yeah, so the question is, as rewards professionals, especially in a global capacity, how do we find data, and even in the lack of it, how do we use that data to make sure we're paying competitively, responsibly, kind of in either markets that don't have a great prevalence of survey data, or even developing markets. So, and I don't want to speak for the Purchase Group, but Warren Heaps is over at the Purchase Group, and they're kind of some of the foremost experts. We're terrible. Some of the foremost experts in international compensation, especially in emerging markets. And I believe one of the things that they do is they don't necessarily look at incumbent pay, because that's what employees are getting paid. What they look at are the ranges for those rates of pay. And if you think about, for a lot of us, our rates of pay, if you kind of normalize that out, look at overall comp ratios, probably, hopefully, most of us are around a 1.0 comp ratio. Maybe not as much anymore, but I think that is kind of a bench that you can set. And that lack of data, when you're trying to find, many employers and many employees, you may not be able to find so many employees, but you can find multiple employers and kind of use that as a guidepost to say, this is where we want to be. Now, the other areas that we can look at too is, there are lots of job boards out there that do have ranges posted within their internationally as well. So we're doing it for the UK over time. Canada surprisingly doesn't have as much data as you would expect, but there are lots of countries. And what we found with some of our clients that have been testing some of the things is they say, well, it's not a lot of data, but it's better data than no data. So at least we kind of have 6 data points instead of 600 data points. We can say, that at least is an indication of what we could be paying. But you're right, it's tough. I think a lot of it is really kind of relying back to the experts in those local markets and really kind of trusting your HR, like trust but verify, your HR business partners and kind of your recruiting teams in those local markets, and then getting creative with other sources of data. And I've talked to some folks in the UK. UK is not an emerging market, but trying to see if they have like sources of data similar to like our H-1B visa programs, where you can go by company, how much are they paying, different kinds of what's the prevailing wage for those locations. But I think a lot of it's really digging into it and reaching out to your local networks in those organizations or in those countries to see if they've got other sources too. But I would certainly check out the Birch's group. Warren's great, and they've got a ton of knowledge around that area.
How do you handle the volatility, not just within a single survey, but within different providers? So same job on paper looks like it would be exactly the same, but wildly different pay rates.
It's interesting, yeah. So one of the funny things is when I was working for this company, we got acquired and they were like, you're paying people in Seattle too much. It's like, yeah, you guys know what you're talking about. Like, Seattle's expensive. And I said, you're paying them too much. So they hired Aon to come and look. And Aon was like, you're paying too much. This is humbling. And I said, why? Like, we're applying a 15% geographic differential to the Seattle market based on a national cut. They said, cool, you're overpaying. And a lot of the surveys, what you have to really kind of take into consideration is who's in those surveys. And what you'll oftentimes see is that national cut is very heavily weighted towards an industry or a sector or a region. And so a lot of that differential is already built into it. So for us, I think they were like, you should be applying a 4% geographic differential. And I laughed. I was like, guys, you guys are crazy. But then they showed me the methodology and kind of the approach they use. I was like, okay, that actually makes a lot of sense. So I think, taking a look to see who's in the survey and kind of what's the differential around it is a fantastic way to kind of manage and control some of that volatility. It's something you can do. Like if you're handy with Excel, same kind of thing I did with the different years, do it by locations and jobs. You can kind of start to bench against, we've got these jobs in this location, these jobs in this location, it's the US sample. Find the delta, figure out what that number is, and then apply that as your geographic differential to kind of manage some of the that volatility that we're seeing from one job to the next. Yeah.
What do you think about the strategy of using data from your talent acquisition folks of the people who they talked to who said, get out of here as well?
Yeah. So the question is, what do I think about using the data from our talent acquisition folks where their employer or their candidates came back and said, nah, that's too low. We won't consider that rate of pay, right? Did I get the question right? Yeah. I think you have to consider it. I think at this point, it's foolish to kind of turn back and say that, nah, that guy's crazy. He's not crazy. There are so many companies, and who knows if this will continue, where you're seeing these software engineers earning, $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 a year in total direct comp. It's out there. We're starting to see that, that the market is saying that's maybe not sustainable to be paying folks this much, and where we're seeing some of those pullbacks with some of the big tech companies. But it doesn't mean that someone else isn't out there willing to make that payment. And I think that what we have to do as comp professionals is figure out from an organizational perspective, do we need 6 engineers or 20 engineers? Because we do have budgets. And I think, there's that value prop of why do you want to come work for us? That's one of the things that you have to do. What makes this work engaging and exciting to come work for us? And folks that are really driven by money, it's probably not going to be a good fit for them, and they're not going to be able to get what they want out of that from your organization. But there's a lot of folks that are also very willing to take a little bit of a pay cut to have an interesting opportunity and to really shape the business. But to your question, what will we do with that? You have to consider it, and you have to force the business to make a decision. What's the budget? What's the internal equity impact? Because I think our role as comp is to be advisors and kind of help them make those decisions and explain the pros and cons to each of those, but not making the decisions for them. But yeah, we're seeing a lot of big numbers are out there right now, especially with rates of hire.
So your friend who went to Facebook, $1 million question. Did he go through the same role for double the money?
Yeah,
It was.
it was, yeah.
It wasn't the management role that he probably should have gotten at your.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
question on that, because I think that's a big disconnect.
It is,
Some of the stuff we get feedback on.
Did he stay?
Is he's
Still
in the
there,
same
loves
role,
it.
and they're like, no, the person's managing 3 other people, and I'm like, well, that's why they're making more money.
Right, yeah. Yeah, that like for like is a big piece of it.
Okay.
Arnold, you have a question? No?
Well, if you like-
I thought you had an easy question for me.
well, you know my questions are not easy for you.
I thought I saw your hand up earlier. Well, we got a couple minutes left. I got shirts, but I also got time for more questions too.
What is your advice for internal equity when we're hiring outside of these premiums on top of premium rates just because of the hire?
Yeah, one of the organizations I worked for, we had a group of customer support folks that all had a comp ratio of 0.85. Like just overall, no one was paid within 10% of the market. And I mean, no one quit. Like everyone loved their job, nobody quit. Someone finally quit and they went up to hire and they're like, that's 15, 20% more than what we're paying. And we're like, that's market. So the business had a really tough decision. They're like, well, shoot, do we hire, at market and over internal equity, or do we actually just hire, do we not hire and try to find someone that's willing to work for 20% less than market? The advice we gave them was you got to hire the people at market. I mean, and we need to fix the folks that are outside of market. There's no way that was going to be sustainable, because once that person, you're kicking the can down the road at a certain point where you're just saying, we'll just fill it up when they leave and bring someone else on. Because I mean, it's really difficult to hire someone 20% below what we're seeing in the market. But I would say make a plan for it.
You don't have a crystal ball, but you read my mind because it's customer support.
Yeah, well, that's one of the roles we're seeing too. It's jumped up 30%, or I think they jumped up 16% in the last year with what we're tracking. I mean, it's silly. I mean, but it's the reality. Anybody else?
For wage compression, I know you said you see it a lot, but like, what is your advice back to those companies? I mean, you can't really do widespread market adjustments.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this is where it gets to be really hard at the end of the year, at the merit budget planning cycle. I've had different conversations with different folks around like, they're just philosophical. What should we do with different rates of pay? Some folks are looking at not skill-based pay, but actually basically putting everyone on a step scale, and then actually doing significant bonuses based on performance. So what that would do is help control for that compression challenge, but then doing very aggressive with bonus targets and saying if your meets expectations, you'll get a couple of percent. If you exceeds expectations, you'll get 15%. And really kind of, I mean, obviously we're all gonna, we should be looking to do that anyway, but I think philosophically the idea is to really kind of leverage that pay for performance approach and make this, like if your meets expectations, that's great. But maybe it's 1% for you this year, and they're gonna be like, well, I lost inflation. It's like, but most folks, I mean, right now merit budgets are still around 4 or 5% for most companies. So you got to realize and kind of decide how important is it to keep your highest performers versus your meet expectations folks. It's going to be, that's the hard part. There's no right answer. It's always going to be a tough decision. But it is what it is. Anybody else? Awesome. I'm really glad you guys came. This is super fun.
Thank you so much for sharing all your information with us. Thank you all for being here. And here is your reminder